As I mentioned, I used to be a criminal court judge in Texas. If I had my way, I was writing the law the way I thought it would be best to stop the demand. These people that are convicted, they not only go to jail. You talk about having photographs on the Internet. We'd have the photograph of the customer, the person that abused the child that had been sold into sex slavery. That'd slow that down. It'd slow the demand down if we started publicizing who those people were if they were convicted. If there was no demand, there would be less supply. And the demand is the answer, I think, Mr. Speaker, into going in after stopping this scourge on the United States and other countries. There are over 100 organizations that support this bipartisan legislation. I'd like unanimous consent to put the names of these 100 organizations into the congressional record.
Without objection.
That's the first step. Hold a person who buys this crime accountable for their conduct. But let's go back to the victims of the crime. The victims of the crime need help as well. In fact, that should be our first priority, rescuing those victims. I told you about how many shelters there are in the United States, or beds, less than 300 beds for minor sex trafficking victims exclusively. And we need places to take these young women primarily and help them regain some life, because life had been stolen from them. So how do we do that? I mentioned to you we spend $25 million a year on domestic sex trafficking victims, about $85 million a year. Foreign countries receive that. So we're introducing soon the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. Once again, Carol Maloney, bipartisan, is helping be the co-sponsor in the House. I mentioned bipartisan for a lot of reasons. This is a bipartisan issue, but Carolyn Maloney, she and I don't see a lot alike on a lot of issues. I mean, we disagree on a lot of things. We don't even speak the same language. I mean, she's from New York, I'm from Texas. We need an interpreter even when we talk to each other. But on this issue, it is an American issue. And I appreciate the work that she's done, and others on both sides, on focusing in on trying to solve this problem. And once again, John Cornyn in the Senate is leading the efforts over there. And so what we're going to do on this piece of legislation is try to fix current law that was first originated, I think, by Chris Smith from New Jersey years ago. And let me explain to you the problem with this. When a victim from another country is trafficked into the United States, and let's use a girl, a young girl, because she is from a foreign country and she is trafficked internationally into the United States, and if she's rescued, she is able to receive certain services from the Health and Human Services. She can be certified as a human trafficking victim. Once she receives that certification that she is actually a trafficking victim, there are certain services available to her, but only to international victims. So this law will say, look, we're going to treat international victims, yes, help them, but if it's a domestic victim, they're going to be able to receive those same services, and shelters will be able to receive those same services as an international trafficking victim. So once they can obtain certification that they are a trafficking victim, then they can apply and receive those same services as well. But also, we want to be able to have funding for these shelters that we need throughout the country. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to talk to you about raising taxes. That's not the issue, or even taxpayer money. So how are we going to come up with some money for grants for these nonprofits throughout the country that are really doing as good a job as they can, but are short on money? Well, let's go back to the courthouse. We got people that are coming down to the courthouse who are being convicted of being involved in human trafficking. We get the customers involved in punishment as well as the trafficker. This legislation would require that these criminals pay rent on the courthouse. They'll pay for the crime that they have committed, the system they have created. Not just with going off to the penitentiary, the Do Right Hotel, but they're going to pay into a fund. $5,000 will go into a fund. And this fund then will be money that will be open for grants, going through the grant process of the federal government for non-profit organizations and other organizations, other government entities, to receive for funding to help the victims. So the money is needed. We're spending $25 million. Let's get some more. Let's punish those criminals, make them pay for it, go to prison, hold them accountable, pay the fine. And, of course, the fine would come after restitution. There would be restitution to the victim. Federal judges know how to do all of those things. And then the money would go into the fund to trafficking victims. Similar to the VOCA fund concept that was used or began several years ago, where criminals generally in federal court pay into a crime victims compensation fund. That money then goes to crime victims. But this would be a special fund that those people convicted of those dastardly crimes would be required to pay into. So that's the basis of the bill, and let's try to get a grip on that this issue, hold people accountable, hold the trafficker accountable, hold the person that's the customer accountable, and then rescue the victim and treat her with the dignity that she deserves as a human being and get them out of that slavery that they have been trapped into. So we'll soon introduce that legislation in the House and in the Senate. Mr. Speaker, this conduct that I have talked about, I would hope would concern Americans. As I mentioned, I spent a lot of time at the courthouse in Houston, first as a prosecutor, 22 years as a criminal court judge. Saw a lot of victims of crime, a lot of children. A lot of those cases, many of those cases, were crimes that were sexual assault. Sexual assault cases are a unique type of case, Mr. Speaker. Sexual assault cases against minors has a dramatic impact on the minor. Sexual assault against minors that have been trafficked into slavery, I don't know of anything worse because of the repetition of the crime that is committed against that child. And these traffickers, when they commit these crimes, these assaults on young women primarily, boys as well, are older, adults who are still forced into prostitution. That is a sexual assault. It is a crime. And when a person commits the crime of sexual assault against another, it's more than a physical crime. It is a crime where the perpetrator tries to steal the soul, the very life, the very heart of the victim. And sometimes, Mr. Speaker, they are successful. That is why sexual assault is such a horrific crime, because it goes after the inner being of the victim. And that's why it ought to bother us that occurs. It ought to bother us that what's taking place other parts of the world, whether it's in Europe, Central South America, and in the United States against children. It ought to make us mad so that we can do something about it and hold people accountable. Congressman Jim Costa and myself, Democrat from California, and I started the Victims' Rights Caucus several years ago, 2005, bipartisan, to try to help victims of crime. We have a lot of members on